Now, if we had to decode the Russia-Ukraine war today, there will be two versions and both can be explained from two key speeches, Vladimir Putin's in Moscow and Joe Biden's in Kiev. Both paint versions of the war that are polar opposite. For one, it is about the existence of fatherland. For the other, it is about geopolitics and morals. And Ukraine is just in the middle, paying the price for it. Today we ask, what lies ahead? The war has completed a year. We've seen swathes of land taken, retaken, lost again. Is this a vicious cycle, or is the war headed somewhere?
Part of the rationale behind the next Russian offensive is probably to disrupt Ukraine's ability to regenerate the capacity to go back on the counteroffensive. So a lot will depend on how many of its reserves Ukraine has to throw in and how badly their casualty rates go up in stopping that Russian offensive.
Now that means a new offensive, something Ukraine has been preparing for since winter began. The spring assault. How will this look and what will be the new target? We've seen some hints in the past weeks. Russia has intensified its push to fully capture Ukraine's eastern industrial heartland. Broadly, this region is called Donbass. Moscow is constantly trying to shift the front line further into Ukraine as far as it can stretch towards the west.
What we're already, seeing here is that the Russians are digging in for the long haul. They have no intention of losing, depending on what their definition of winning is at this particular stage. And Ukraine cannot afford to have Russia basically annex its territory.
Now, this is one of the largest conflicts in Europe that has killed tens of thousands of people, turned millions into refugees, reduced entire cities to nothing but rubble. So if this war drags on, will Ukraine be able to hold its guard?
The bad outcome, as it were, is that Ukraine runs out of steam and is unable to take back most of the remaining occupied territory before that new wave of Russian-trained mobilizees and industrial equipment starts to come in at the end of the year. And at that point, we're headed towards, I think, a long-term stalemate.
Russia and Ukraine both hope to turn the tide of the conflict with big offensives. Look at Bakhmut. It is an eastern Ukrainian city that has become a flashpoint. For months now, soldiers from both sides have been locking horns. They've spent ammunition at a rate unseen, never before seen in any armed conflict since World War II. For Ukraine, defending Bakhmut has become an important symbol of resilience. For Russia, it is crucial for its bigger goal here.
I think we will fully liberate Donetsk and Luhansk republics. We will incorporate them and that's it. It will end there. This is the final. But we will still be under pressure just as we have always been.
But will it end with Donetsk and Luhansk? The Kremlin has insisted that any political settlement must include the recognition of Crimea. That's a region Russia annexed back in 2014. So, if Moscow does not stop with Crimea in 2014, then why will it stop with Donbass in 2023? These are the exact fears of Ukraine, which has categorically rejected these demands. Where does that leave the peace process? Ukraine is waiting fighter jets and more battle tanks. Russia is looking at Iran and China for more arms and ammunition. When have weapons ever ended a war? But one thing is clear, the conflict has entered a decisive phase where one thing can make or break this war. For more on this, we're now being joined by Mark Sloboda from Moscow. Mark is an international relations and security analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast.
Thanks for having me.
My first question to you, there are no NATO boots on ground, but the West is standing firmly behind Ukraine. NATO has been trying to avoid a direct conflict. How do you assess the situation?
Okay, that's false. There are NATO boots on the ground. The Washington Post and the New York Times have admitted that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. and European special forces, commandos, CIA on the ground directing the Kiev Putsch regime forces on the ground. So, I mean, this is a conflict with NATO, with all of NATO. They are still, to a certain extent, a proxy war, but those red lines have been crossed long ago. Where the conflict is going in the next year, in the first year, Russia, through, I believe, a naive gesture, wanting not to escalate with NATO, limited their special military operation in terms of both manpower, hardware, targeting to a very small fraction of its existing conventional military force. With it in the second year, with NATO going whole hog into the conflict, I think we're going to see a very different scenario from the Russian military. And we have heard in recent days the ever more petulant and desperate whining from the NATO Secretary General. NATO is out of ammunition. They're out of artillery shells. The Russian armed forces have not only demilitarized the U.S.-backed proxy regime that seized power in Ukraine in 2014, they're well on their way to demilitarizing all of NATO.
All right.
They are out of artillery shells in what everyone agrees is an artillery war. That is not very good for them.
All right. Now, on that note, just for more clarity here, Russia has intensified its push to fully capture Ukraine's eastern Donbass. Now, Russia blames the West for pumping arms to prolong this war. Do you think Russia and Ukraine will be able to get on the negotiating table and maybe reach lasting peace anytime soon?
No, I don't believe that there is any possibility of negotiations with the U.S.-backed putsch regime in Kiev. We have seen numerous agreements in the past simply be laughed at. They were used simply to buy time, to build up a powerful proxy NATO force within the country. The Minsk agreements, the January 21st agreements, we have heard from both Merkel, Macron, and the previous putsch regime leader, Poroshenko, that they never had any intention of fulfilling them. The U.S. has a long history of just tossing aside every treaty and negotiation it has ever been involved in, from the anti-ballistic missile treaty to the short intermediate range nuclear forces treaty, the JCPOA with Iran. The Kiev regime has actually put forward laws that forbid them from negotiating with the Russian president. There is no one that I see that is a capable partner of negotiations of diplomacy that Russia can trust. Therefore, I do not believe that this conflict ever in truth ends until the U.S. proxy regime that seized power in Kiev in 2014 is removed.
All right. Well, Mr. Mark Sabota, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast with your insights on this. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.